right, we're going. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this podcast. This podcast is going to be a short episode. It is the accumulation of my semester-long research and analysis project I did on masculine representation in the media. Specifically, I did an archetypal analysis of the character Bill from The Last of Us, episode 3, who represents a new form of metrosexuality that is not defined by an urban setting, but rather the opposite, a post-apocalyptic setting. The research I did for this analysis grounds itself in Connell's work on hegemonic masculinity, which outlines that there is a hierarchy of masculinities being performed in different ways, and they're constantly engaged in struggle over inhabitation of that dominant hegemonic framing of masculinity, which itself is imbued with power. So, just to start off, my name is Grady. I'm a senior communications major at Gonzaga University who just finished his senior thesis, and I'm here with, who are you?
My name is Mac. I am Grady's older brother.
Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on for this was because we grew up in the same household. We saw a lot of the same things. And one of the things I noticed in my research, and this is more from anecdotal evidence, but I realized that a lot of people in our generation experienced some kind of generational trauma, or their sense of self through their sense of masculinity has been kind of warped in the way that it was taught to us as children. A lot of our fathers gave us maybe outdated definitions, maybe rigid, maybe associated traits that worked for them but didn't for us in our current status quo. What would you have you noticed that as well? That kind of trend of a lot of people in our generation not having a sense of guidance in their masculinity?
I think so. I think masculinity evolves over time, and so like the way that our parents, our fathers learned to be men were much different than like the world that we grew up in, and so maybe a lot of the stuff that they were trying to teach us and like the guiding principles, the rails, if you will, have they're not as applicable in this day and age, whereas, you know, maybe back in the day, it was good to be like the bravado guy, but now it's like, you know, that can come across as kind of fugazi.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like other qualities that, you know, in this day and age, it's different.
So you mentioned that it's always changing, which goes into the concept of hegemonic masculinity, which I'll just outline real quick. It was first defined by Dr. Connell, who outlined this hierarchy of masculinities, like I said, that are constantly struggling over power. How would you say the ways that you were taught by our father, the ways that the values and the values that were instilled and the traits that were desired by our father, how would you say that has functioned in this modern, or in your life? You know, like, how do the traits and values that he instilled in us, have they worked? Are they outdated?
Yeah. I've seen our father cry 3 times, I think. 3 or 4 times. There wasn't a lot of talking about feelings in the household.
Mm-hmm.
And if feelings were shown, it was kind of... The feelings that were shown were anger. That was like the main one. There wasn't any sadness, no vulnerability, which I think stems from our father's upbringing. He didn't have any outlet for any of that,
Mm-hmm.
Which is difficult, I know, for me, because I'm a, you know, fairly emotional dude who, you know, will cry. Is he going?
Yeah.
Hell yeah. And so I think it's outdated because a lot of what we were taught by our father was to like like we weren't shown healthy ways to have outlets with our emotions, and like what that does if you don't have any outlet is that it just ultimately like kind of explodes in like outbursts of typically anger if you don't have like healthy ways of dealing with your emotions. And I think that's one thing that to this day I struggle with, is like at times I can be, you know, very healthy and like open about my feelings, and then, you know, at other times I might like keep things inside more than I should.
And do you think, I've definitely noticed the same thing. I think
it's not healthy.
It's not healthy. Not at all. I think in me, it manifested like an overly critical way of processing my own emotions.
Yeah, you get analysis paralysis.
Exactly. Yeah. So rather than letting them flow through me, rather than you know, embracing your emotions and coming to terms with them, you kind of just, at least the way I've compensated is by just thinking my way out of it, which has not always ended in the best situations.
Yeah, I had a therapist. My first therapist told me that I do this thing where I think so I don't feel, as a way to try and stop myself from feeling hurt or sad or vulnerable, when the reason I'm trying to protect myself is because I was taught that those things are weak. When in reality, it turns out that, funnily enough, ladies love it when you cry, and I didn't know that, and I've been learning that in my adult life now. So I try and cry crocodile tears for the ladies.
And so it's obvious that our father was one major influence in our expression of self and our ideas on masculinity and the performances therein.
Yeah, in some way though, I feel like we like really rejected that. Like you and I are both very like different from our father.
That is very true, yeah. And I think I've noticed that among other people in our generation too. Like, there's a lot of people who you meet, there's a lot of young men who seem very different than their parents, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a trend of
generational differences, right?
Yeah. I don't know, I guess there's always a filtration of the values and ideologies behind these concepts as it passes down through the generations, because, you know, things get lost in translation. Maybe the lessons the father was trying to teach you don't get communicated perfectly. And then, of course, there's your own experience of applying them in the real world, and you make your own assumptions about things based on information. And yeah, there's a filtration. So like you said, the definitions of masculinity are constantly changing and constantly evolving.
Totally. Agreed. I wore nail polish for like 6 months.
I did too, actually.
Yeah, fire.
Yeah, it works. It's a cool style.
Hell yeah.
So it's obvious that our father was one main influence in our performance of masculinity. At least for me, 'cause you know me, I was always a big stories guy. I always loved going to the movies, loved reading books, all that stuff. That was a very large influence on me as well, was masculine representation in the media. Do you think that influenced you as much, or was it more experiential learning?
I think I battle with that within myself, where like...
What do you mean?
Like, I want to be this like warm, open, loving person to those around me, and like especially with like partners, and then I'm like in the back of my mind like, oh, you know, comparing myself to, you know, the masculine image that's portrayed in media of like the big, strong, like tough, no emotions guy, and I'm like, oh, is that guy just like, would that guy know how to handle this situation better, and like would not, you know, letting my emotions, not like showing emotions in this situation be like the best thing? And I think that's like a very unhealthy thing for me in my relationships. I definitely compare myself to other people and like other dudes more than I should, which is very unhealthy. And I compare a lot to like this idea in my head of like that I've gotten from everything that we've always been told about, like, this is the big strong man and it's the football quarterback who gets the girl, and that's definitely something I've wrestled with, specifically in my, like, relationships.
So would you say that emotional openness is at the core of that, like hiding your emotions, or is it?
I don't know. I think you can, like, be, like, I think, like, it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable. And so, but it's tough to do that in a household where you try and do that and you just get stomped on. And then I've been in relationships where, like, you show vulnerability and, your partner, like, rejects the vulnerability. And that was an early relationship I had, and made it very difficult for me to be, like, really vulnerable with future partners. And I felt like I've kind of gotten better at that, like, trying to be vulnerable and, like, exposing yourself, right? Because, like, I don't know if we're going off topic, but
No, it's all good.
But, like, when you're vulnerable, you're, like, exposing yourself, where, like, you're giving, like, that person that I'm being vulnerable with, like, could hurt me with that information. And so it's, like, takes a lot of courage to, like, open yourself up to that, to people, and to trust in people. I don't know if that has anything to do with masculinity.
Yeah.
But
No, totally. Because a lot of it is, like you said, the ways, like, if you're thinking about how would Iron Man have done this, or how would John Wick have done this, or something like that. One of these. Maybe John Wick's not the best idea. He just killed everybody, but. But these.
He had emotions, though.
He did. Yeah.
That was the whole thing. That was the driving factor behind everything.
Actually, that's a fair point. They killed his dog.
Yeah.
And
thus his wife.
And so you mentioned how, if you're thinking about how these people would do it, that doesn't really, or these characters would do it, that hasn't been the best guidelines.
No, because it's just comparing yourself. It's just like, I'm comparing myself to, like, somebody else. Like, I'm just, a lot, like, relationships are very relevant for me right now, given the situation that I'm in. And so, like, girlfriend comes to you with issues about something, maybe doesn't deliver it in the best way, it comes across pretty harsh, when in reality she's just trying to solve, like, an issue that she had that, like, I could help her solve, but the way she delivers it, I might, not handle it well and say something snarky or something that's, like, not productive, and then afterwards, like, sitting there like, oh, well, like, image of dude in my head would have solved this and, like, handled this way better, and I think that image in my head is just, like, some, like, god of a human who's just excellent at everything, and I sometimes beat myself up if I mess up.
That's a good segue in a way, because, like you said, you have this image of yourself in your head
which changes every day.
It's always changing. The things associated with that image are always changing, but it is always there. You always have that desire to be that version of yourself, to be that thing. And that directly ties to the concept of hegemonic masculinity, because that's exactly what it is that there's this image that's been created in the media of the perfect man that we should all strive to be.
Like George Clooney or some shit?
Yeah, exactly.
George Clooney's epic.
Be him a debonair gentleman, or
what was that word?
Debonair.
What does that mean?
It's like highfalutin, kind of classy,
I like that
high
word.
taste.
I'm gonna use that.
Yeah, it's a good word.
Debonair.
That's
an SAT word. You should get points for
that. And so hegemonic commercial masculinity in the media has created this very rigid definition of what is masculinity, which creates this idea in all of our heads. And I think part of the reason that we strive towards framing ourselves as a part of that, or as you know, embodying that image is power, because a lot of the ways that masculinity is represented in the media is very imbued with economic, ideological, social, and just raw physical power. And I think masculinity is a subject very fraught with volatile power in today's age. And I think that's where a lot of people get...
What do you mean by that?
I mean, it's become a subject that is at the core of many of specifically our nation's problems. So, for example, the rise of Trump. A lot of that is very deeply tied with masculinity, because masculinity is one of these hegemonic identities that has dominated American culture, or United States culture, since its inception. And in recent years, especially since the 60s with all the social justice movements, the power structure has shifted drastically, which has created this sense of nostalgia, of mourning for power lost in specifically white men. And that is a great motivator that was capitalized on by Trump. If you look at the rhetoric of his campaign, it's fascinating, because he promised revenge, he promised redemption for what his audience thought was a theft of power. In reality, it's just the natural hegemonic order of things. Things change. There's different ideologies. There's different needs for the time. There's different performances of identity and things that work at these times, and so things change.
I like how you say performances of identity.
Yeah, that's at the core of this research, because
I didn't think about identity as a performance, but it makes sense.
It is, yeah, because that's why I did archetype as my lens, was because archetype is based in psychoanalysis, which is traits and behaviors. And so the archetypes that are shown in the media, and how we, like you said, this image of yourself, what that image is a list of traits and behaviors that you would
funny, smart, handsome.
Exactly.
Trying.
Where I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with this? Performances of identity.
Yeah.
And power, and the meaning, the performances of identity that you see in the media creates this image that you want to ascribe to, and because that image is framed as being culturally powerful, I think men are especially vulnerable to the desire for power. I think it is built within us, because I've noticed this in myself, as I've done stupid things, and then in retrospect I think, what was I doing? And I realize, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was seeking power.
You don't think it was because you don't have
control.
a fully formed prefrontal cortex?
Well, that definitely plays a part, but that plays a part in our desire for power. Because I think...
Give an example.
Think of kids. Think of like elementary school kids on the playground.
Yeah, I was not the nicest kid on the playground.
I was not either. But I mean, you could go off thousands of examples from there. But let's say two young boys are about to get in a fight, and one of them decides to walk away. Just decides to say, you know what, I'm above this. I'm not going to do it. And they walk away.
How old are these kids?
Say 6th grade.
Okay, that's a mature 6th grader.
Yeah, really. Yeah, development of the prefrontal cortex.
That guy's going places.
So let's say he walks away, and then a third one comes in who calls him names for walking away.
Ooh.
Now what is that?
That kid's immature.
Exactly. But why is it that third kid did that? Because
he sees weakness, or he thinks he sees weakness, and he wants to point it out.
Exactly. And through exposing this weakness, he frames himself as more powerful.
Yeah.
So that itself is a, a an act of pursuing power, you know.
Interesting.
Shaming people, all
Yeah, it's like
any
the bully.
kind of-
It's like the bully was the kid who got his ass beat at home, and so he goes
Exactly.
and tries to take power on the playground, which
exactly.
is, you know, somewhat similar or somewhat relevant for me at least.
Exactly. So power is a very fundamental aspect of how masculinity is performed. That was actually the playground idea, and specifically the topic of shame was one thing that I wrote about in my paper that I noticed a lot growing up. Was we kind of, our generation developed this definition, this very rigid definition of masculinity, and if others didn't hold true to that definition, they were shamed. So, for example, trying to think of a good one. And this goes beyond.
Oh, you don't want to jump in the water because it's cold? You're a loser.
Exactly. Something
You're
like that.
weak. You're whatever.
You're weak, you wussy, you
Exactly.
sissy, you little girl.
Exactly.
And a lot of the ways that this shame was enacted was through gendering, which frames masculinity as the superior gender. Because
I ain't no bitch is like the most toxic thing somebody could say.
Exactly. Mama ain't raised no bitch.
Yeah.
I myself said that.
Are we allowed to swear?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
We can, yeah. We'll just keep it tame.
Yeah.
All right. So, moving on.
You're crushing it, bro.
Thank you. Moving on.
I like the way you're thinking about things and presenting ideas. It's clear that you've put a lot of effort into this, so keep that shit up.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, dude. And now it's recorded.
And showing appreciation is another great way of expressing masculinity, because in a way that's the opposite of shaming. It is rather than demeaning somebody else for the sake of raising yourself, you're raising somebody else for the sake of raising yourself.
For the sake of raising yourself.
It's, all ships float higher on a sea that rises.
A rising tide lifts all ships.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah.
Close enough.
You got the idea.
Yeah, I got you, bro.
So kind of going back to that idea of what I noticed in our generation growing up, representation of masculinity in the media, especially in the 2000s, was very, very commercially masculine, very rigid trait definitions.
And when?
The 2000s. So right around the time
when they wore the gigantic baggy jeans and giant t-shirts.
Exactly.
That shit was whack.
This may be
Hurricane Chris, hey baby.
This may be throwing some radical ideas out there. So I would like anybody listening to this to take this with a grain of salt. But I heard this one theory about 9/11 and how that impacted masculine performance in the United States, and how it basically removed the option of vulnerability as a performable trait in the media, because suddenly we were engaged in this war on terror. Suddenly geopolitics was a very fraught subject, and America was at the center of it, and suddenly we had to show up. We had to be the big guy, we had to
you hit
be
me,
macho.
now I'm gonna bomb you.
Exactly. And so out of that we got the rise of extremely commercial masculinity, like I was saying, like Iron Man, stuff like that, So a lot of these characters that we grew up with are extremely rigid archetypal performances, and especially for me, that influenced me because I was very media centric in my thinking growing up, or in my formation of thinking growing up. And so I think it's very relevant to, especially for our generation, with the generational trauma and the ways we were taught through the media to perform our masculinities. or performer masculinity. I just think it's a very relevant subject to talk about for our generation, and
Totally.
I think a lot of people could benefit, if not from this research, then just from a little bit of expression of the self, you know?
Oh yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying, bro.
So I want to dive a little bit into my analysis.
Yeah.
So like I said, I did an archetypal analysis of the character Bill from The Last of Us, which the reason I chose him
Bill's goated.
was, because Bill is goated. He's one of my favorite on-screen characters ever, and his position on HBO, or his character being on this specific show, is one thing that makes it relevant, because masculinity is most center stage in the mainstream media. It is the most center stage identity in almost all forms of media, because it is one of the most dominant core identities. And so a lot of our main characters are masculine, a lot of supporting characters are masculine.
The patriarchy.
Exactly. And there's a lot of economic factors in the media industry that result in these biases.
Mm-hmm.
And so I chose to do Bill partly because of the popularity of the episode. I heard reviews that said that this episode was HBO's magnum opus. It got glimmering reviews across the board, and it just seems like...
Could you go as far as to say it got, like, shimmering views?
Nah, we'll stick with glimmering.
All right, fair enough.
And so mainstream media is a platform through which masculinity is debated. And this specific episode was very popular, and it seemed to get shimmering reviews across the board. And so I really thought it was interesting what this says about the media, or about audiences in the media specifically, because Bill's character wraps together a lot of, according to definitions of commercial masculinity, a lot of conflicting traits. So he's introduced as this isolationist, reclusive, doomsday prepper who's politically alt-right. He's got the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, gun racks all over his...
Yeehaw, brother!
Yeah, exactly. But then throughout the course of the episode, we realize that not only is he gay, but he's willing to be vulnerable. He is emotionally honest and open, and he is yet still these traits that have not been allowed, I guess you could say, as a part of masculinity. They function within his character, like it works, and it makes total coherent sense. And I think part of that is because the setting of the show, being in the apocalypse, creates the absence of social pressure and surveillance, which is a large motivator for in performances of masculinity.
Big time.
So like we were talking about with shaming and encouragement and stuff, that's all social pressure and surveillance. Are you acting like you should be? You're not? Okay, let's do something about this.
If you deconstruct like every single thing that you do in your life and tie it to like some, like, the underlying motive for why you're doing this and this, would you then think that everything was pointless?
Say that again?
Like, I'm just thinking about like friends that I have that are like very free spirit's a good word, good way to put it, where they're like, you stop believing in anything because you're just like aware of all of like the underlying currents of like why anybody is doing anything. Like, instead of being like, oh, that guy's got drip, you're like, oh, look at him putting on a show to try and like flaunt his masculinity or express himself, and then you're like, is that just too much thinking to do?
Dude, you're getting to the core problem of being a comm studies major.
It sounds depressing.
This is like the running joke among all of us, is that being a comm major ruins life because you just suddenly are not.
Well, it's a slippery ass slope to go down if you start thinking about every single reason why anybody's doing anything.
Yeah, you're not allowed to not critically think about something, about anything. But
I don't have enough brain capacity for that.
It is a great asset to have. Going back to the topic,
I feel like you're psychoanalyzing me too much now. I'm gonna be scared.
You never realized I was doing this my whole life.
I know.
Going back to the topic. Let's see, where was I? So, Bill represents one side of things, but he also represents another side of things in that he has traits and behaviors that are very traditionally masculine, but he also expresses emotional openness, vulnerability, love as a gay man, and yet his character functions as one cohesive whole. And I think the setting plays a part in that because, like I said, the absence of social pressure and surveillance allows for a more free expression of identity and performance therein.
Thought experiment. If you created a world where, sorry to derail you once again.
No, go for it.
If you created a world and were somehow able to remove every social pressure, what would happen? Would humans become like cavemen?
That is interesting because that gets to the question of human nature, which I think cannot.
Which at the end of the day is just, sorry, go ahead.
Is just to do what must be done to survive.
Yeah, it's what is it? Evolutionary. What's it called when you're like, I need to have as many babies as possible to like preserve my like genome or my DNA. Like I must, like the seed must continue.
Evolutionary optimism.
Evolutionary optimization. I don't know. I learned about it in a psychology class one time. I think.
I get what you're saying though.
Evolutionary thing. It's off topic.
Did you have like a question or something though? Or was
No. It was just a thought experiment, and I just have no answer to it. So
I don't. That was actually one thing that I mentioned in my paper, was that the framing of the setting, the absence of social pressures and surveillance could, I'm not going to make any claims about what would happen in the real world.
Why not?
If
People... I'm just kidding.
No. No. I think it's undeniable to say that social pressures and surveillance has played a massive role in the shaping of modern human nature, if you will, because I think human nature changes. Like I said, it's just you got to do what you got to do to survive.
Facts.
Yeah, I don't know. That is a very good thought experiment. I'd encourage the audience to think on that. What would your life be like if you were not pressured to act the way you should? Quotations around should.
Or humans just social creatures, and so those social pressures will inherently always be there unless you are on an island alone and then you paint faces on volleyballs. Because that's what you do with no social pressure.
Now there's one interesting representation in the media. So yeah, back for the third time, guiding us back in. So Bill's character, it functions, it works, and these traits that seem kind of unnerving at first, they seem odd because we're not used to seeing them juxtaposed in one character. They make a good argument for a more complex performance of masculinity, because I believe that it's impossible, if well-being and happiness is your goal rather than some kind of objective or material aspiration, I think you need to take a holistic approach, and it's simply not the ways that masculinity has been portrayed in the media is simply not holistic. these rigid definitions based on traits and behaviors don't allow for any kind of dynamics, and because of that lack of dynamic change, that lack of mobility, it invites tension, it invites resistance, it invites struggle over these meanings, which then only is exponentially increased as, you know, the division between identities grows farther. And yeah, I think that the character of Bill, from an analytical perspective, makes a good argument for complex masculinity, which is the conclusion that I came to in my paper, is that we need to show that people who embody these traits, those don't define them. Traits are not a defining factor. Behaviors are not a defining factor of masculinity. Rather, it's how you use those traits and behaviors to achieve something, be that what it is. So in this case, in the case of Bill, his traits and behaviors come together and align under the goal of Frank being his purpose. So at the end of the episode, he leaves a note behind for Joel that says, take anything you need, the bunker code's the same as the gate code, but in reverse, blah blah blah. Anyways, I never liked you, but still, it's like we're friends, almost, and I respect you. So I'm going to tell you something because you're probably the only person who will understand. I used to hate the world, and I was happy when everyone died, but I was wrong, because there was one person worth saving. That's what I did. I saved him, then I protected him. That's why men like you and I are here. We have a job to do, and God help any motherfuckers who stand in our way. Jeez. So pretty powerful message there, and it's a clear emphasis on the protector role, which I think gets at this deeper argument for aligning traits and behaviors, for thinking of them as tools to achieve some kind of purpose. In this case, that purpose was Frank, in Bill's case, but it differs, you know, person by person. However, I think an uphill climb is an essential part of the human experience, and masculinity has been denied. That's not right. I think representations of masculinity in the media and the generational trauma that our generation specifically has experienced has inhibited that performance, and our ability to think of traits and behaviors as tools rather than defining factors, rather than defining aspects of our identity.
That was cool. I like what you said there.
However, this is
I never thought about traits and behaviors acting as tools. Because like,
do you think that's a good like way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I was just trying to like think about like examples in my head as you were saying it. Like, he was like this protector, right? And like that was like protecting, you know, the person that he loved. But there are people who are like, I'm a protector, and like, what does that mean? It's like, I'm protecting my front lawn, and anyone who comes on this, I'm gonna blow their brains out.
Exactly. That's what I was like just about to lead into.
Yeah, that was nice.
It's kind of a slippery slope.
Yeah, well, it's a tool. It's like what are you using it for, right?
Exactly.
Like
you know,
I guess good is subjective. Like, are you using it for good? But that's like incredibly subjective. But I can totally see what you're saying about it being like a tool.
Mm-hmm.
That was just one example. I'd be curious, like what other roles and archetypes are there, and then like how would those be interpreted like differently?
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, I think.
I liked what you said there. That was smart.
Bill,
do that shit again. Keep that shit up.
Bill represents, I think, a new trend that is aligns more with that framing of traits and behaviors as tools for the sake of achieving some kind of purpose. However, like you said, that, you know, that style of representation could be decoded, could be taken in a way by each individual audience member that, you know, would be defined by their own confirmation bias. So, for example, if you take a show that has a powerful message of this, saying, use your skills, use your tools and traits to be able to achieve your purpose and achieve happiness, what if the person watching that, what if their definition of happiness is, snapping and ending half of the universe?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a slippery slope.
It's like, I see the point.
But so yeah, I think the conclusion that I came to in my research, after my research and analysis, I should say, was that Bill represents this new form of masculine representation that builds on metrosexuality, in that it is more.
Would you consider me metrosexual?
Yeah, I would say so. You're
Nice.
pretty. You're. I wouldn't say you're a pretty boy, but you're very knowledgeable of style, and you're very aware of your own presence. And I think that.
Does metrosexual have to do with being in touch with your feelings, or is it all like a presentation?
Well, it's more a presentation, but it's metrosexuality was a trend in the media around the 1995 through early 2000s. That
Prince?
ended.
I guess he was way before that, but
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. I think it's more characterized by urban, fashion. Rigidly.
Prince wasn't urban with his fashion.
Well, okay, fair enough. We could go into that, but we don't need to.
Prince is the man.
Prince was the man. But this concept of metrosexuality is important because through it, so it's a trend in the media of representation that basically showed an emphasis.
Yo.
Guys, we're doing a podcast right now. So, where was I?
You were talking about metrosexuality as a trend in the media.
Yes. Metrosexuality is a trend in the media that placed emphasis for these characters on self-appearance, but because of the associations of that, and its alignment with queerness, it became a way of addressing the tensions between masculine representation and masculine reality, I guess we'll call it.
Okay.
Because it gets at those tensions from a unbiased, or from a more neutral perspective, whereas it's still heterosexual male, however they're expressing themselves in a way that is not very traditionally masculine. It's a little bit more feminine, so it's kind of a bridge between these two styles, and Bill is a reemergence of that method of addressing the tension. But it's more of a. I think it's even better at it because it embraces the extremes of each side more, in that Bill is a doomsday prepper. He's pre the fictional outbreak in the show. He would be, you would lump him in with QAnon folks, stuff like that. But then he also represents the other end of the spectrum, the other far end of the spectrum, in that he's gay, he's vulnerable, all these things that are not traditionally masculine. Yet, like I said, it brings it together. And under the setting of the apocalypse, I think it places an emphasis on the importance, of finding meaning in the masculine identity, especially in this modern age when meaning is so scarce. So yeah, just want to open it up to you. If you got any questions, kind of gone through all of my ideas, expressed what I wanted to say. What do you got, if anything?
Well, first of all, I think it's cool that you're very comfortable talking about these kinds of things, because typically talking about these kinds of things doesn't happen a lot with dudes our age, I feel like. So it's cool that you're so aware of it. It's cool to see that you clearly put the effort in to become aware of that. I'm sure you kind of been thinking about this stuff your whole life, but then this gave you a way to
yeah,
kind of standardize it and like
Yeah.
have a way to think about it, which is cool.
Gave me a lens
Yeah.
through which to analyze.
I was still chewing on the piece about the behaviors and like actions, or behaviors as like tools, and like what you said about Thanos. Because like his whole thing was that he like loved the universe, right? He loved everybody,
Mhm.
but then his way of doing it, he was still, the love was there,
Yeah.
but the behavior was not. Like there's some great moments where it's like, oh, they just really cared about everybody, but their way of solving or protecting was just like not the best way to go about it.
So would you say that if we were to take this new trend that Bill represents of, thinking of traits and behaviors as tools for the means of a purpose, if we were to take this, or if this were to become the new, the new fad, the new meta, the new style of masculine representation, would you then say that we would need to add on another framework of like discussing the implications of that and like assessing whether a utilitarian or a deontological approach?
First of all, I don't know what that word means.
Utilitarian and deontological.
I know what utilitarian means. I have no idea what deontological means.
Utilitarian is.
I know what that one means.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So you know what a utilitarian is? Batman is deontologist because he has a strict set of rules. It's not the means, or it's not the end justifies the means. It's the means
code of
justifies
principles.
the end. Exactly. It's the moral guidelines that he lives by. For him, that's don't kill. But he still does some pretty vile stuff.
Whoa, he's a great guy. He doesn't have any generational trauma. Or I guess that wouldn't be generational because they died. That would just be trauma.
They got killed.
That would just be trauma.
So yeah, I think.
I don't know. I don't know if you'd need another framework. Like
You say
I'm
just-
sure one would evolve, but like I don't know. Like, can you tell me like if we could all be like as sick of a dude as Bill was, like life would be a breeze.
Yeah. Imagine.
If you could love somebody like that purely and like openly and honestly and like safely and securely, like that would be epic.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it just takes doomsday, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the absence of social behavior, social pressures, and surveillance. So yeah, any other questions, or do you want to wrap this up?
Well, I'm functioning on about 3 brain cells right now. You can cut that out if you want.
Alright, looks like we're done. I want to thank you guys if you got this far. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that this research I did and the analysis I conducted and our conversation about the two has been at least a little bit educational and giving you something to think about. So,
if you are looking for a man in touch with his feminine side, ambitious, and
alright, enough of that. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's been an awesome time, and yeah, hope you learned something. Have a good one.